Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University, and welcome to this video on task analysis, which is a part of instructional design. Task analysis is also sometimes referred to as instructional analysis. This video represents part of the instruction for a graduate course in instructional design at Misericordia University. In this video, let's consider task analysis. What exactly is it, and how does an instructor or an instructional designer perform a task analysis? Finally, let's give you some examples that you can try to learn what task analysis is all about and how it contributes to successful instructional design.
Task analysis is sometimes also called instructional analysis. So what is a task analysis? It's a process of thoroughly examining the task to be taught through instruction, thoroughly. It is based on the instructional problem, because we define that in the needs assessment, and then it's used to define the content of the lesson. Even more so, it will precisely determine what the learner needs to know before approaching the lesson. That would be the prerequisite skills. And as a designer, we can either test for those, we can assume those prerequisite skills, we may have to review them, or we could just assume them based on what we know about the learners. Precisely, it will tell us what the lesson must cover. It must cover all the steps that we derive in the task analysis. And then, as we look at all the steps, we can determine which parts of that task may be optional for the learners. Task analysis is at the heart of what the instructional designer is going to do. Think about what you're going to teach. If you're a classroom teacher, you can look at the faces of your students while you're teaching something. If you didn't quite get all of the clarity that's needed to understand the task and to perform it correctly and accurately, all you have to do is look at the faces of your learners, and you'll be able to tell if they're getting lost in that process. Now, what happens if you're going to design something for remote use? Maybe you'll never see the learners. You'll never get to see their faces at all. So you cannot go in, I don't want to say half-baked, but it's got to be perfectly baked, because the learners will not be able to give you that feedback so that you can clarify and clear up fuzzy understandings, or say, whoops, I forgot about this prerequisite, or I forgot to tell you this sub-step. That's why the task analysis is so critical to designing a good technologically facilitated training product. We use a task analysis anytime that we're developing training, absolutely. But also, if you're writing procedures for someone to follow, if you're putting together some manual, some procedural list of tasks to perform, if you're performing human error analysis, if you're designing a computer interface, it's critical to know exactly what does the user have to do step by step. So employing a task analysis ensures that we fully understand the task in all its details. And as we perform this, we include salient details, all the important steps. We make sure we don't miss any of them. But we also take a look at the minor details as well, and we determine what is essential to include into training. Are there other details that really don't have to be taught? They're not really relevant to the purposes of training someone to perform the task. Or some of the details might be prerequisite skills, and learners may already come in with those skills. Once a designer fully understands the task and all of its details, then the designer can set out to determine what are the major points that need to be taught. Then performance objectives can be developed for instruction, and then after those objectives, we know exactly what the students need to learn, then we can determine how to assess and ensure that we assess each of those major points. So when we set out to perform a task analysis, here are the general steps we do. Number one, we determine what's the instructional goal, what's the overall purpose of this instructional module. Then we set about to delineate the major tasks and also the subtasks or the components of that content. And then in some way, we organize those components and we try to determine the relationships between the components. Ultimately, we basically want to answer three questions when we conduct a task analysis. What must the learner know in order to accomplish this instructional goal? What must the learner be able to do in order to accomplish this instructional goal? And what does the learner need to know before approaching this instruction? Performing a task analysis is both an art and a science. But here are some general steps as to how you can approach performing this task analysis. You're going to teach something. So start by listing what it is you're going to teach. Now, the way that you list this, it depends on the content itself. But start by listing it. Are there steps? Are there facts? Are there concepts? Are there principles? What should receive attention in instruction? What are the main things to be done here? Depending on the content, you can approach different sources to determine how to perform the task which you're going to analyze. It could involve observing someone perform the task, looking at descriptions of the task, looking at other instruction that exists on performing the task, some documentation of some sort, or you can approach a subject matter expert. If you're a classroom teacher, you might already be the subject matter expert. So after you list out what are the main pieces of the task and the content, then arrange the components in some logical order. Again, you could be looking at any type of content. So is it something that's chronological? Is it numerical? Is there some order you can put it in that makes sense? Do you want to start from the simple and move to the more complex? Does it make more sense to begin with the concrete and then move to the more abstract elements? Do you want to move from the overview to the detail? Or, for the sake of that particular content, does it make more sense to move from detail to overview? Maybe you can start with the familiar for your learners, and from the familiar, build on that and move to the unfamiliar. The bottom line is, list out what needs to be learned, what's part of the task, and then let's arrange those components in some logical order. At this point, realize that we are considering what the task is. So don't worry as much how we're going to teach it or which components we need to teach. We'll figure that out as we analyze this task analysis. This is a good tool for determining what needs to be taught. After we have the content and after we determine some order in which to put it so we can understand it and make sense of it, then let's connect the components. If there are relationships between components in some way, let's design it so we can see that, so it becomes clear to the designer. And then, after you have this completed, now examine your representation and then perform the task and look at what you have missed. Are there some small components that you forgot about, or oh yes, well, we just assume everybody knows that. Well, make sure that you have all those pieces in there. Later on, we'll decide Are some of those components understood to be already recognized and known by the learners? For now, get it all down. As you do this, use some kind of notations, marginal notes, to suggest different thoughts that arise, like techniques of how you might instruct this, how you can help the learners remember these steps, as well as understand them better. You can identify different potential problems that you could see, knowing your learners, where they might encounter some problems, because that will have implications for how we present the content. Maybe there's another training piece that needs to be included in that. As you go through, see if there's prerequisite knowledge, concepts, or skills that somebody already has to have in their possession before they can approach this training module. And again, it may have implications for how we perform the setting up of our training module. And finally, revise your layout to incorporate all of this information that you have and produce a final version. You will then use this final version in designing instruction. Having considered the 6 major steps in approaching to perform a task analysis, let's look at overall, what are we doing? Ultimately, we want to determine, what does the learner need to do very specifically, step by step, what's involved in performing the task. As part of that, determine what knowledge is needed for each of those steps. Is there certain prerequisite knowledge required? Can we assume that the learner knows this information? Does this need to be taught as part of the instruction? And also, as a side, in the margins, think about how you can effectively teach this step. Are there different cues you can give? Are there some mnemonics, some analogies, some metaphor? Are there some techniques? Are there examples that you could use that are going to be specific to that audience? What you know about the learner characteristics, something that will speak to them. After you have clearly identified all the steps that are involved in performing some task, then let's analyze that. We can cross out the tasks that learners already know. We don't have to teach that. Now, maybe some of that material will be important to mention, that you will recall that you do this and you perform that, but we don't have to teach it, so we can cross that out. We can circle optional tasks. So some learners may already know these, they're options, but they may not be essential to the task here. So what's left, those tasks are going to be what the learners need to know. This is what we need to cover in instruction. If you are analyzing a task where you're not the expert in the task, you could do a literature search. Search online. See if you can find an expert performing that task. You could interview a subject matter expert, also affectionately called a SME. You could walk through the steps with somebody who knows that well, with a subject matter expert. If you're a classroom teacher, you might be the SME. The trick with the task analysis is to be very careful and ensure that you have not missed any steps. So analyze very carefully. Try to write the directions of what to do. Write those steps from an absolute novice's point of view. Go over the task several times. Ensure that you've caught every step. Involve others if you need to. Have someone else test the steps that you have listed down and see if they say, oh yeah, I ran into a problem here. I think something's missing. Or have another subject matter expert review your work. The key is, don't miss any steps. We're going to look at some examples in a few moments. You'll be surprised when you try to teach something that is ordinary or common, and it seems like it's a very simple, straightforward process, uh, it can be very complex if you're a novice because there's a lot that goes into these things. We'll hold that thought for just a moment. What kind of analysis is needed for that particular content? How are you going to approach organizing the steps involved in performing that task or in successfully completing that particular task? Well, it depends on the content and the way it's naturally organized. The most straightforward is a procedural analysis. If there are steps that can be followed, like one through so many, then you just list the procedural steps and make sure you don't miss any. Maybe the content will define that you need a hierarchical analysis. And you have to sequence the skills and the sub-skills. Maybe there are rules or just concepts. Maybe it's just categories of information, and then you use a cluster analysis. Or maybe you can list these tasks, these steps, these events from easy to more difficult. Let's take a better look. As a designer analyzes a task to be learned in great detail, um, we start to gain an appreciation of the complexity of all the tasks involved in order to perform even seemingly simple skills. Gagne calls this a learning hierarchy. Let's say that we were looking to teach something about subtraction. Now that sounds like a very straightforward, simple task. Let's take a better look at all the skills that are involved, the learning hierarchy involved in performing subtraction. If we would like to start with simple subtraction, which many of our learners might already know, and if we would like to lead the learner to the point that they can subtract whole numbers of any size, consider all of the steps that are involved, that learning hierarchy, before they can bridge the gap between simple and subtraction of whole numbers of any size. You have to be able to deal with successive columns. They have to be able to deal with the zero when it's understood. They have to identify when borrowing is needed. They have to be able to subtract a one-digit number without borrowing. Then they have to do successive columns without borrowing. And then they have to be able to subtract when single borrowing is required in any of the columns, subtract when several borrowings are required in non-adjacent columns, subtract when successive borrowing is required in adjacent columns, and then they have to be able to subtract when double borrowing is required before they can subtract whole numbers of any size. After performing task analysis, we can see that there's a whole lot involved, and what initially seems like a very simple bit of content, it can actually be very complex. As you approach the task to be analyzed, consider how the content is just naturally arranged. Are there steps that can be arranged in a linear or sequential format? And you know exactly where they start, step 1, and maybe step 6, where they end? Well, then you use a procedural type of analysis. Is the content just naturally formed in such a way that there's really no logical order, but there's just various things to be done in order to meet the stated goal, but there's no particular procedural order for them? Well, then we use a cluster analysis to analyze these tasks. As in the case with our mathematical example on subtraction a moment ago, are there certain tasks that have a certain relationship, whereas the learner cannot perform, let's say, the third task until he or she has mastered performing the first and second tasks? Well, then we would perform a hierarchical type of analysis. And that's what we did when we looked at subtraction. If the content is such that you can specify steps 1 through the last step, however many steps that could include, then you could actually represent it through a flow chart. Now, a flow chart not only can show steps 1, 2, 3, and so on, but it can also show different decisions that might need to be made. So, for example, here we have a decision in the process. So here we can see the start and going right through the ending. But when we reach this point, if the answer is no, then we travel through this path. When we reach this point, if the answer is yes to a certain question, then we travel through this route and then join up with the other steps. So procedural could be represented through a flowchart. In the example of this content, which I've drawn from professional literature, the 8 coaching principles, notice that there are 8 separate principles as illustrated in this diagram, but one is not more important than the other. One is not necessarily performed before or after another. So in this case, we did a cluster analysis so we could understand how are all of these data, these elements of this task analysis related. In this analysis, we're going to take a look at what are the steps involved in preparing a cup of tea. Again, seems like a very straightforward, simple example until we start analyzing all the steps and all the prerequisite knowledge that's involved. So here we've done this as a hierarchical analysis. Prepare the tea. We need to heat water, add the water to the cup, and place the tea bag into the cup. Now, let's analyze each of those steps. Heat water. Well, depending on your learner and the learner's experience, well, there's a lot involved because you have to do all of these steps in order to be able to just get the water heated before you even attempt to go to major step number 2. To add water into the cup. Notice the level at which we're looking at all of this. There's a lot involved here. But again, some of this we may be able to cross out and say, well, the learners already know this part of it. If they've already learned how to heat water, then all we have to say is heat the water. If we haven't done that, and if they don't already know that, well, we better make sure they can perform all these steps. Add water, and then put the tea bag into the cup. Now, it's easy to skip a step. When do we stir it? Do we have to take the tea bag out? How long do we wait for that? See, there's even more steps that could be included here if the learner is going to truly perform all of the steps with great success at the end. So this will determine what we teach and also how we teach it. As we mentioned earlier, not only do instructional designers use task analysis, anyone who is going to create an app would have to perform this analysis as well. So if we were to design an app to perform something like setting up a grocery list, well, there could be a lot of steps involved and decisions along the way too. So we would want to really analyze the tasks so well that we can create an app that is user-friendly and something that's intuitive and also something that will be very productive for the learner, or in this case, for the user. Now let's try our hand at it. Let's perform a task analysis to fix a flat tire on a car. Now, some folks will know how to do this well, and others will not. So this could be a task that we could teach. So pause for a moment and think about what are the major steps involved, because this would be very procedural and also hierarchical in nature. We would not need a cluster analysis here because there's a definite series of steps to perform. Pause the video and think about it. Try your hand at it. And when you're ready, click to continue and let's examine our results. If you tried your hand at performing this task analysis, what did you get for the main steps? I got these steps. Secure the car, obtain your tools, and get the spare tire out. You have to jack up the car. You have to replace the tire. Then you have to jack the car back down. When you're finished with that, then you put away all your tools, the tires, and do something with that flat tire as well. Now you can tell these are just main steps. We now have to determine sub-steps. What do you mean secure the car? Well, there are even some steps that come prior to that. For example, you have to, if you're on the road and you encounter this flat tire situation, you have to get your car safely off the road. So there are a couple of things to look at in terms of that. And then we have to make sure it's in gear with the parking brake on. If it's in such a spot, you might have to put something to wedge under the tire to make sure it's not going to move. And that's only one step. So you can see there are a lot of sub-steps. Now, after we look at this very thoroughly, then let's determine what the entry behaviors are. Do people already know that they have to get the car off the road to a safe location? Well, maybe we don't have to teach that. What are the things that we have to teach? What are the things that we don't have to teach? When you're completed, you will be able to articulate the prerequisite skills, the instructional objectives, and also any options or additional material that could be covered, or maybe you won't cover it, or maybe you'll cover it in an additional optional module. As you can see, these steps, the task is much more complex than it appears on first glance. And again, if you're teaching in a classroom, you get to see the faces of the students if you've missed something and they're now becoming lost. If you're offering training through some technologically facilitated training module, some product, you may never see the faces of the students at all. So the task analysis becomes more critical than in the classroom. If we were to consider analyzing the tasks that we perform on a regular basis, and they're second nature to many of us, if we were to teach it, so we analyze it before we can teach it, we realize quickly on that all of these tasks are much more complex than we initially thought. Consider if you're going to bathe a dog. There are a lot of steps in there, or it's going to be really messy and the dog will never get clean. If you're going to balance a checkbook, that's a whole task analysis unto itself. Making a bagel or a pita pizza, just like making the tea, there are a lot of steps involved. If you were to wash your clothes, well, it seems like pretty easy. We're going to take our clothes and throw them in the washer, turn it on, but there's a lot of steps in that. For fun, let's go out to instructables.com, and here's a task analysis, how to do laundry in 16 steps. On this site, how to do laundry in 16 easy steps, really, this is a task analysis. Notice, they've started out with the ability to use the washer and dryer. They talk to prerequisite skills. They talk about equipment and materials that are needed. And then I like how after every step on this website, they say you can add a tip at this point, or ask a question, or make comments. In other words, as designers, we're always making it better. We're always refining it more and more. So let's look at just several of their steps, because it's done very well. Start by separating clothes, whites and colors. But then they say, oh, wait, but there's further categories here, cotton and wool and lighter materials. And then there's delicates. Okay, so really there's a bunch of steps, sub-steps involved in this separate the clothes. But separate clothes is a major step. A next major step is to select the water temperature. Now the challenge here is, as the website suggests, refer to the label on the clothing. But what happens when you now find one article says cool, and one article says warm, and one article says hot water? Now this makes a lot of difference, because you could run about 10 loads, and maybe you could run just only 2, depending on how you interpret all of these data. So again, many sub-steps could be involved here. Select the load size, the type, start the washer, add the detergent. Again, that's a major step. Add a robust, a big step. Well, how do you determine, and how much should you put in? There's a lot involved in that. Then add the clothes to the washer, and that's probably our easiest step. And then add fabric softener, that's optional. And then you notice, as they're going through, they're saying, oh yes, but there are other particulars. We have to be careful. Don't use fabric softener on certain items. So again, we would have to list that out. After we perform the task analysis, we can then go in and see, did we perform everything? And also maybe certain things, can we cross them off because people understand them, or it might be prerequisite knowledge and they may already possess that. Part of their steps now go into the drying. So I'll let that for you to discover if you would like. So they're basically saying 8 steps in washing clothes. If we look at the sub-steps, this is going to turn into a major project, especially if you're going to teach a novice for the first time approaching this with no prior experience. This can be a big project. Having considered how to perform a task analysis, take some time now to reflect on your project for this course. Examine, what task do you propose to teach? How involved is your task analysis going to be? Do you need to refocus it? Maybe you need to focus on a part of a larger task. After performing the task analysis, what tasks do students already know? Identify that part, because you don't have to teach that. What tasks are optional? Maybe those are additional add-on modules later on, but they're not essential for the primary task. Think as you look at your task analysis, and ideally as you perform it, what is the best way to teach each step of the task based on what you know about your learners from your learner analysis that you've already performed. Keep in mind that after analyzing the entire task in this step, you may decide to divide instruction into different modules of learning. Now for this course, even if it's a very complex task, you can develop a prototype on only one module. So maybe we would take, in the case of the washing the clothes, we would take only one portion of that, and we would allow other portions to be covered in other modules of training. So reflect on how your project will look.
Having considered task analysis, in our next video, let's consider universal design in learning and how that applies to instructional design. Then beyond, let's consider a media analysis, and having done that, let's start looking at writing objectives to start designing instruction. Thanks for watching.